Season 1 brought a lot of changes with it to the first Descendant, giving us new weapons, new skins, new events to take part in, and one frosty woman that raises the bar for Descendants in more areas than one. And while everyone flocked to Hayley trying to see just how large her skill modifiers were for themselves, in the background a few Descendants got a few changes to improve their viability. Jaber got a couple of turret changes, Ajax got his barriers and Voidwalk skills adjusted, but the real one I had my eyes on this whole time was Blair. Now I did release a video talking about the upcoming changes for Season 1 and what builds I'd be taking in ready for these buffs, and after messing around with his new kit and playstyle, well, let's just say it's enough for Chris Evans to pee a little from excitement.
Reladling.
What now?
In this video we'll go over what makes up my Inferno build in modules and gear, how the general playstyle and gameplay loop works to get the most out of Blair, and most importantly, do I think he's in a good state now or needs any other buffs? If you do learn something useful with this video and want to see more Blair breakdowns and guides, make sure to drop a like and subscribe so you can find your way back for more uploads. With that out of the way though, it's time to get spicy. Alright then, so it makes the most sense for us to head straight into the module so we can have a look as to how we built Blair, and then we can have a look in the gear afterwards. So let's open up the module screen and let's talk about the buffs and what it's done for his playstyle and his general kind of play in when he's out and about in missions. Now previously it used to be a case that his gameplay loop was dropping down flame zones, bringing those back in to buff himself up, dropping down the same flame zones once again so that you then have the buff from the extinguish as well as his passive, so you had full max crit or crit rate chance that you possibly could do from his kit, and then also the max amount of skill power modifier, and then you're able to start getting into the rest of the gear before you then kind of had to redo the loop once again around about 5 or so seconds later, because that's when the buffs kind of ended. Well, it's changed a little bit now, it's definitely a bit more streamlined and it feels so much better to be able to play, because now it's a case that you drop down your flame zones. You're then able to use extinguish, so that part has stayed the same, but the difference here is the fact that the flame zones haven't disappeared. Now that doesn't sound like much just by itself, but keep in mind that these flame zones are staying there and they've had a MP reduction as well as a duration boost as well, meaning that these will stay here for 15 seconds at just a standard. Now obviously we're going to buff these a little bit more because we do want to keep those flame zones out, and that is going to keep our passive up for as much as possible, as well as it's then going to trigger extra things with the extinguish. Now the reason why this is so good is the fact that extinguish, when you bring those back in, at max stacks you're only allowed to take 5 zones at a time, but every single one of those is going to give you 8% of your max MP back at a time, so if you get max zones out, if you have 5 down, you're able to activate this skill, you're able to get 40% of your max MP back every single time you activate Extinguish, and because it doesn't cost MP to activate, that is just free MP right there. This is absolutely fantastic. This means that you want to have a decent chunk of max MP in your build, but you know, we're kind of factoring that in when it comes to the modules, and I'll explain the reasons around that, because like I said, the more max MP that we have, the more we're going to be able to get back, the more we're able to use our skills a bit more freely, etc, etc. You can see the loop that's going to be happening from there. On top of that, 5 stacks of skill power modifier increase, so we're going to get 30% across every single one of our skills, which is going to be really nice. I believe the skill power modifier is also pretty much generic, which means that our damage over time is also going to benefit from that as well, so our burn tick damage as well, it's going to be 30% stronger, so we do have things like that, and we're also going to be able to bump up the duration on that. Now the real thing that we want to look out for when it comes to, if you want to play Blair, and this goes for firearm if you're going into that, it goes for the big massive fireball if you want to go for the big Chungus ultimate, and especially with this build, is the fact that you want to minimize the cooldown when it comes to your blaze up skill, and also your ultimate, but mainly your blaze up skill, and then you also want to increase the duration of those flame zones, and then you want to minimize the cooldown of your extinguish. This means that you can then have flame zones that are constantly out. The longer the better, because that means that you're able to easily stack up your passive, so you'll be able to hit the max crit rate as much as possible. And then on top of that, because your extinguish is now down to as low as 8 seconds, and even lower because I'll talk about some of the modules a little bit later, we're able to consistently keep farming the same flame zones over and over again. So every single time we activate this and it comes off cooldown, we're basically drawing the power from the exact same flame zones that were already out there. So, you know, with these ones at 19.8 seconds as standard, and this cooldown is down to 8 seconds, that means we can farm the same flame zones twice before they then disappear. Now, we can get a little bit faster than that, but, you know, let's just work off the base numbers that we can see in front of us for the time being. But that means we're able to get up to 80% of our max MP back from just having 5 flame zones out on the field at any one time, which is absolutely fantastic. It means that Blair never has to worry about MP worries or anything like that, it's really easy to be able to get yourself back up and then start casting all of your skills out. Now, the other big changes that kind of happened were going to Burn Taste. Burn Taste has now had a DPS increase from its multipliers, which is really nice. It also now benefits from duration increases, so you can see there we've gone from 4.5 seconds to 5.9, and this is going to be the way that we're going to have that 100% uptime when it comes to our flamethrower as well. And it's just a really nice damaging ability. It's really good now. You can, because of the ways we can stack up skill power and we can stack up skill power modifier with this build, this is going to be consistently hitting for some really nice numbers in 6 figures every single time. It's fantastic, and this is every single 0.3 seconds as well, so it's going to be hitting for, I think on some elites it was hitting for around about 140 150k, and that is every 0.3 seconds. On top of that, it's applying burn. On top of that, we've got the flame zones as well. You can see as to how the DPS kind of matches up, so you're not going to individually see one big number when it comes from Blair, but it's going to be a consistent, like, gradual kind of like burn, obviously with this kit, in terms of like how fast he can actually start melting through some enemies. Other changes that we had were to go into his Pitmaster passive. This has now gone from 5 stacks up to 7, but it does mean that we have had a change for how the skill critical hit rate works. It used to be a case that if you had 3 stacks, it was a maximum of 20%, if I believe, and then now it's a case of, depending on how many stacks you can have out, we are getting 5% per critical hit rate, which is additive per every single one of those. Because it's additive, that means it is going to be affected by mods that we've got in here. So, for example, emergency measures, we are going to get an additional 64.6% of our crit hit rate on top of whatever this figure is actually going to be giving us, which is really, really nice. At base, this is 5 stacks with Classic Chef, which we are using for this build. That goes up to 7, which means we can get up to 35% additional just additive critical hit rate, which is really, really nice. And then our ultimate has now been changed because of Classic Chef. Even though Classic Chef displays the old text, this has now gone up to 5 small fireballs, which means 5 flame zones, and, you know, it just instantly triggers 25% just from using this ability alone, which is absolutely fantastic. So you can see as to pretty much how this kit kind of works. So we've now got that. So how does this all kind of, how are we putting this together when it comes to our modules? Now, you will notice a couple of these, well, most notably these 3 right here, are not fully maxed out, and there is a reason for that. 1, because of our module capacity, but 2, because we don't actually need the full boost from each of those, and I will explain those as we go through each of the module choices. So we have grabbed Classic Chef. This means that we are going to be able to get up to 7 stacks of our passive through being able to put down flame zones. Absolutely fantastic. Puts us up to 35%. It's not necessary for this build, so if you don't have this, don't worry too much, but it does give you a little bit more nice consistency when it comes to the critical side of things, and it's just really nice to have to benefit from having those extra flame zones out, and it just makes the ultimate just even easier to be able to use. So it's more of a quality of life. I think it just makes a generic build for Blair much easier to use, and it's just really nice to be able to put in there. So if you do have it, feel free to be able to get that slotted in, but you don't necessarily need it for this build. So we do have things like sustain, so we do have increased HP, so we are going to need some kind of sustain, mainly because once you activate Burn Taste, which is going to be the main 100% uptime on the main damage dealer, you're going to be a slow walking target. You're going to constantly get hit by things, so you do need some HP to keep yourself alive. We have things for cooldown, so we do have Nimble Fingers at 21, so just 1 off the full, and we do have MP Conversion at maxed out. MP Conversion is more important to have maxed out due to the fact that it gives a bigger kind of cooldown. So it's worth being able to get this one maxed out rather than Nimble Fingers. But those are going to be primarily the main ways that we're going to have our cooldown. On top of that, we are going to have Focus on Fire, which gives us more skill cooldown. It also gives us fire skill power, just to be able to chuck back through all these. Because all of our multipliers are now over 100%, it makes more sense to go into skill power rather than modifiers. But we have done that through the use of skill simplification, because that 64% is going to go on everything. That means it's going to go on the damage over time. It's going to go on to the actual impact damage of the skill. It's just really nice to have across the board. The main reason why we don't have this maxed out is because in combination with MP Conversion, if you do have both of those maxed out, you will lose 40% of your max MP, and as we've already clarified when it came to Extinguish, we're going to be basing off our max MP how much MP we get back in from actually using that ability. So we're kind of trying to limit that, but also still get a benefit from the module, and I think this is the nice happy balance between the two. So this puts us up to the 100% skill power modifiers for both the impact as well as the burn for flame zones, and that means that going forward from there, then we can maximize into skill power, and that is the most amount of damage that we should be able to squeeze out of this build without starting affecting our cooldown. So yeah, this is pretty much the way that I would suggest it. We do have our crit modules. We have skill concentration for max skill crit hit damage, and then we've also gone for emergency measures over front lines because we want to increase the hit chance and still get a benefit to our crit damage. And with this one, we should be hitting at 7 stacks of our passive. We should be hitting around about the 90% crit hit mark. So this is the you can obviously push that higher if you do go for the blue one. That if you go for skill insight instead, but I feel like 90% is consistent enough, so therefore I might as well start going into my crit hit damage, and that just gives me some really nice kind of consistency in between all the damage numbers and everything like that. We do also chuck in a skill extension. This increases our duration of our abilities, so this takes our flame zones from 15 seconds up to 19.8. It also affects the duration of burn taste, so this goes from 4.5 seconds up to 5.9, so that means we're going to consistently chuck out this ability a little bit more. But it also affects the passive, oh no, not the passive, it also affects the buff that we get from aggressive flavor. So this now lasts for 13.2 seconds instead of 10 seconds, so it kind of extends out the gameplay loop, which is fantastic because the less downtime that you have with this build by going through building up stacks and then bringing them in with extinguish and all that kind of thing, the better, so you're going to be chucking out even more damage. So I do think that's going to be worth it in the end. Obviously, the more duration you have on flame zones, the easier it is to constantly have your passive up. Gives more time for your cooldowns to come back, so you can activate these abilities again. You're essentially going to have more stacks up for longer, so therefore your crit rate into your burn taste, so even while you're casting this ability, you're still getting that. Duration is really nice. It's just a nice quality of life to have in this build, so I do think that just having one mod in there to be able to get some of that is really, really nice. But the one mod that we really should be talking about is the one that feels like it's pretty much designed for Blair from the ground up, and that's multi-talented. How this one works is that depending on the type of skill that you use, you get a 5-second buff. Now this buff cannot be removed through like activating other skills or anything like that. It purely goes on for the full 5 seconds, and then after that, whatever skill you activate next gives you a different buff or gives you the same buff. While using your offensive skills, because they are all dimension skills, this will give you an additional 20.5% skill cooldown, which is absolutely fantastic. This is how we go able to get through to our 100% uptime with this with the burn taste, because as you can see, our duration is 5.9 seconds, our cooldown is 10.9, doesn't add up, but you'll see that after we activate a skill, so if we activate Flame Zone and then go back in here, you can see that this has now gone down to 4.8 seconds, so we will be able to have that 100% uptime. It also reduces all the other skills as well, which is quite nice. But so, for example, it was 4.4 seconds, I think it was, for a Flame Zone. Now it's going to be sitting at 1.9 seconds, which is absolutely fantastic. And basically everything else will also come down massively, so you can see like the ultimate's down to 19.1 seconds, which is huge considering the amount of damage that can kind of chuck out as well, and then feeds into the rest of the loop. So multi-talented just for that alone is fantastic, but then it gets one better because we also have a singular active skill, which is going to be our Extinguish, which we use Extinguish to get our MP back, but also to build up our skill and power modifiers. And if we do use a singular ability, we're getting an additional 30% all attribute damage on top of everything that we're dealing. So essentially the gameplay loop is now you can use your Blaze Up, you can use your ultimate to start stacking up cooldown, but also be able to stack up all those flame zones down on the ground. You're activating all your passives ridiculously quick. You're then able to bring them all back in with Extinguish to power yourself up to get all your mana back, and then if you've timed it right with your multi-talented, you'll essentially get a 30% damage buff on top of that, from just skill power modifier, but also from multi-talented's 30% power as well, which means that your next burn taste is going to do some insane amount of damage. It stacks into the damage over time, it stacks into Flame Zone. It's just an insane amount of damage that you can just pretty much dish out. So multi-talented is absolutely fantastic, and I would highly recommend that you do rock this one in this build. So that's it for the modules, and that pretty much wraps that up. So let's have a look, talk about the rest of the gear. Now, obviously you do have your weapon choices here, but we're not really going to be using it too much. Because of how this builds and how the cooldowns kind of work, you're not necessarily going to have too much time for you to start shooting. Now, you can do it against like stubborn enemies, you can do it against bosses, feel free, but most of the time, 99% of the time you're pretty much never going to use your guns. So it makes sense to match it to your reactor. Now in this case my Thunder Cage matches to my current reactor, but if you are looking for best in slot, it probably makes sense to go for an Enduring Legacy. The reason why is because even the unique ability of the Enduring Legacy plays into everything that is to do with Blair's kit. So we are going to be hitting enemies inflicted with burn all the time, so we're getting increased firearm attack damage right there. And on top of that, quenching, which is the stacking debuff that you can put on for every single shot of this gun, will also be reducing fire resistance for every single stack, which is absolutely fantastic. So Enduring Legacy is pretty much best in slot, but like I said, you're not really going to rely on it too much, so just make sure you match your mounting when it comes to your reactor. Now speaking of reactors, let's have a look at the one I currently use. So like I said, we've got my Thunder Cage mounting there, but you are looking for a fire skill and dimension skill reactor to increase the amount of power that you're going to be chucking out, because we don't want singular, because Extinguish does 0 damage, so there's no point in having it on there. Now in terms of like best in slot, in terms of like the best roles that you can have at the very bottom, I feel like this is pretty much there. I don't think there's much better that you can get from this, which is going to be skill critical hit damage and fire skill power boost ratio. Now you could make an argument that skill critical hit damage and skill critical hit rate would also be able to then pump it up to 100%, and I probably can't argue with you there on that one, but I will say that fire skill power boost ratio does also go into the base amount of damage, so that it feeds even higher like skill crit, like the amount of crits that you would be doing with your damage anyway. So there's kind of like a bit of a to and fro there. So I do think that this one's pretty much like what you should be aiming for, but if you do get rolls for like skill range, skill duration up, skill cooldown, they're not bad rolls. They're definitely more than usable in this build, but they're not necessarily going to be best in slot for the amount of DPS that you're going to be chucking out. So in this case, I do think that's probably best. But obviously, if you want a bossing reactor, you're going to be wanting pretty much just the standard one, which is skill attack into Colossus as well as crit hit damage as well. And that just leaves us with the components, and it's just really nice and simple here. We're just going to be rocking the 4-piece Slayer set. This is a skill build after all, so therefore the more damage we can get into skill power, the better. So this is the only way that this is the best way to be able to chuck in skill power into a build. So it does mean that we do have a skill cost of 15% increased, but it's pretty much negligible considering how much MP that Blair can kind of like generate every few seconds. It's absolutely fantastic, and he can just generate that resource pretty much straight back to himself, so he doesn't need to worry about little blue balls on the floor, he doesn't need to worry about MP collector, he doesn't need to worry about anything like that. He's just pretty much self-sustained right there. It also boosts up general rounds capacity and rounds per magazine, which is fantastic if you are using an Enduring Legacy. So once again, nice synergy right there, but Slayer Sensor, most skill power, most amount of DPS that you can chuck out, it pretty much is the best in slot for this. Now, if you do want one recommendation for the seasonal kind of like artifact Inversion Reinforcement, there is one thing that I would recommend, and that's actually going to be this selective neurostimulation. Now, I do think this is really nice and generic across the board for most descendants that exist, but essentially it grants one of the following 3 effects every 60 seconds, and it's just a great way of being able to recover extra max MP. So if you are struggling every now and then, and you find that you've been caught off guard or anything like that, it just gives you a chance of being able to get some extra MP right there, just once every minute, and I think that's kind of fantastic. In terms of like most of the effects here, they don't do too much, but I do feel like selective neurostimulation is just great, so it's definitely worth being able to go for one of those. But with all that, it brings the video to an end. I do think that Blair could benefit from a little bit more of a skill power bump in the damage still, as his multiplayers do seem a little bit on the low end compared to what we've seen for others, but he is in a much healthier state right now, and Nexon can always reevaluate that over the next month or season. So Blair won't be taking that top spot anytime soon for the best descendant in the game, but is he a blast to play and fun? Definitely, and I'll be bringing him along for more missions in the future, just to torch some poor souls getting in my way. But this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you finding the first Descendant? What are your thoughts on Blair? And how did you find the buffs that you got for Season 1? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video, and as I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, and I'll see you all on our next video.